Sorry. So that last session was really good, and just as a teaser, both of those frameworks from CCLA and City Mental Health Alliance are in the report to kind of give it some structure as well. But the report was about trying to bring the challenges to life and getting contributor firms to tell us about. Yeah, so it's really about, yeah, I'm definitely amped up now. About sharing some of the ways that the mental health programs have been implemented. So we're going to quickly introduce ourselves, then talk a little bit about strategy and a few specific questions. So should we start with you, Liz?
Yeah, thanks, Ali. Afternoon, everybody. My name is Liz Cole. I'm head of HR at Artemis, and I'll talk a little bit about Artemis if you'd like. So Artemis is 26 years old. We've got about 230 people. So I'm speaking from the SME perspective. We've got a real range of size and scale of firms here today. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Will I go on to...
Give us a little bit more.
So a little bit. So listening to the hardware, software is quite interesting because I would say we're kind of building the infrastructure and the hardware. So we've put in place the types of benefits and proposition that you'd expect to see in a firm of our size. So we've got private medical, we've got health assessments, we've got the employee assistance program. And for us, there's a big piece around promoting awareness of the benefits that we have. And then at the same time, given our size, one of the things that we can do is take a really personal approach to our people. So we have a big focus on bringing our people together, building connections within the firm, promoting manager awareness. And we're just trying to kind of signpost the support that we've got for people. And then just through those personal connections, just try to make sure that we remember that at the end of the day, we're all humans. We've got lots of stuff going on in our lives. So that's me.
Afternoon, everyone. My name's Debbie Bullock. I work for Aviva, so welcome. This is not my base office normally. As you'll be able to tell from the accent, I've come down from Yorkshire, where I'm normally based. But I'm responsible for wellbeing and inclusion in the UK and broader, which includes Aviva Investors, but also the broader Aviva Group. Our wellbeing strategy came into play in its current format back in 2017, so we're quite well established in terms of our wellbeing programme, and we look at it across be healthy, be mindful, be secure and be awesome, which relate to physical, mental, financial and social and everyday wellbeing. So that's how we position it, recognising though that it's a very holistic programme, and as some of the previous panellists mentioned, you know, it's not just about what happens to you at work. You only have one body and one mind, and you take it everywhere with you, not just, you know, and you can't separate the two. It's not like a bucket with divisions in, it's just one big bucket up there. We have looked at a number of things, and our approach to mental health in particular has evolved over the past few years. Whether that's been around where and how people work and how open they are, and also how people choose to access support and services. So we move from having quite a lot and thinking, you know, the more we offer people, the more people will use it, to understanding a little bit more about what our colleagues are looking for, and actually half the challenge is more about our culture than the benefits we offer. So one of our previous panellists also pinched one of my favourite quotes, is it's not all about yoga and free fruit, it's about the culture of an organisation. So that's really, really important, and we've seen our work in that evolve and move through from the 5 years we've been going. But I'm sure more will come out in questions as we carry on.
And I'm Sonia, the last one. I'm at Schroders, so a relatively large asset manager as they go. We have 6,500 employees across 37 countries. It's a global, we lead our wellbeing efforts globally from the UK, but deployed locally, because we have quite a concentration of employees in a couple of jurisdictions. And when it comes to implementing, I think mental health initiatives in particular, the whole global angle is a really interesting one to work through. I was lucky enough to inherit a really quite well-established approach to well-being. So My team first came out with a wellbeing strategy in 2015. When I inherited it a couple of years ago, one of my observations were we had a huge amount on offer, loads on offer. And it was probably during that time, so I joined during the pandemic of, oh, let's have another app. Oh, and another app. Oh, and let's add this and this. And actually what we've done since is kind of pause, strip back and really focus on what is really going to drive the return that we want to see from our wellbeing investment. And the investment, we're really lucky, my chief executive is really passionate about this, so we've never had to fight for any investment whatsoever. And that almost drove bad behaviours in terms of just throwing things at the wall and see what sticks. So we've really been dialing up the question of how can we assess what is going to be most useful, drive the best returns. I'm pretty sure Alison was talking about our mental health experiments earlier with heart rate monitors, etc., to really understand ways of working. And over the past few years, we've developed a lot of new kind of data-led strategy and models to really assess how we deploy our wellbeing initiatives going forwards.
Okay. So we were going to talk about strategy next. So we're going to talk about how you go from forming a strategy to implementation. And it'd be really interesting, just very briefly, based on the type of company you are, to talk about how it manifested itself.
So I would say we have a strategy with a small s, and at Artemis, a lot of our strategies have a small s. So for us, mental health is part of our diversity, equity and inclusion working group. And the pandemic really accelerated the conversation around mental health, as we said, about hybrid working and, never lose the opportunity of a good crisis. And we became really aware that as well as having some of these benefits and policies in place, and we can't compare with some of the other firms around the table, and it's been really interesting to listen to some of the experts today because we're one of those firms that's trying to put in place a more holistic strategy. But for us, it was about listening to our people and understanding that people were really struggling during the pandemic, so we started to think about resilience and how we support. So we lean a lot on external experts because we don't have that expertise in-house. So we commissioned an occupational psychologist to work with us on resilience. We did some training for our managers on promoting awareness. And then within our DEI working group, some of our colleagues got more interested, involved and mobilized around mental health. So we've got some tone from the top leadership, but we've also got leaders from within the firm at all levels of the firm who are interested in driving the strategy forward. And to be honest, working in HR, it's great to have that energy and enthusiasm, and people just don't look to me or to us for all of the answers, which is great.
Excellent. So strategy to implementation. So we have an ambition rather than a strategy. So our wellbeing ambition, so under our 4 key headings of be healthy, be mindful, be secure, we have a sentiment of what we want our colleagues to feel and experience when they're working at Aviva for each of those 4 pillars. So that includes under be mindful, I want to feel secure and able to raise what I need and operate in a culture of psychological safety, and various sentiments like that. So we've then looked at how, if that's our ambition, that colleagues feel like that, how do we create that for them? So some of the work, and part of my work is actually working with lots of other parts of the people function and lots of parts of the business to create the culture and the structure that will make that sentiment possible for our colleagues. So it's about creating the right things for people to achieve what they want to do from their mental health perspective to help them get there. So we've kind of moved from implementation through, I'm pushing on an open door, but every single part of the business has a role to play. Like you, it's a global program, so you need to understand the cultural differences of where it happens, but it's everything from property and facilities. So are there wellbeing spaces in your room? You have to engage the culture team in our organisation to see what questions they might be asking and are we creating the right culture? Learning and development, what are they doing to help us put the right things in mind? So actually strategy into implementation in a company our size is me talking to a lot of people basically, and saying, this is what I need you to do for the organisation, and telling them why it's important. And it's very rare you hit a brick wall. You might get a not quite now, but I very rarely get a no.
Yeah.
So when we think about well-being, there's lots of different ways, financial and mind and body, and there's different things. But two things to pull out, I think. We make sure we're looking at individual level interventions and provision, team level, as well as kind of group-wide level. And it's a very different strategy across those different things. And we make sure whatever we're doing, whether it's awareness raising, whether it's training, whether it's provision of benefits, etc., we're really looking at those three different levels at which you can access individuals. The other thing is we have developed, based on the academic literature and practitioner literature out there, our own employee wellbeing model. And that very much separates out the input measures of, as an employer, what factors are within our control that can be either barriers or boosters to an individual's well-being. And separately, the output measure of actually, so what is the output measure? How is the well-being of our employees? And separating our measurement framework in that way has been incredibly helpful, because you can see some of the external factors impacting employee well-being is harder for us to control. Whereas if you're measuring, and we've got three pillars of our input measure, which is healthy culture, healthy relationships at work, and healthy ways of working. Those are things that we can monitor. Those are things that we know that if they go wrong, if you hate your boss and can't trust them, or if you feel like the culture is one of not of inclusion, or you love your boss and the company's great, but I'm stuck doing such rubbish work all the time and don't have the systems to help me. They're very different barriers to achieving well-being, and all of them need a different intervention. And so by evaluating our circumstances, we can then deploy in a very tailored way to whichever teams or individuals that we identify in a way that reflects, based on what we can see, are the issues that they're facing. So having that real clear model and the data to back it up to allow us to then deploy our wellbeing strategy at individual team as well as the group-wide level has been quite transformational for us.
Right. Liz, one of the things that I've noted the most about Artemis is the charitable work. Can you tell us a bit about how you mesh that with the mental health program?
Yeah, Ali. Our charitable foundation is a really important part of our DNA, and it's something we're all incredibly proud of. So this week, Mental Health Awareness Week, and it is a little bit at times for us, a bit like Fresh Fruit and a webinar, but this week we're raising awareness on mental health in partnership with the Charitable Foundation and making donations to SANE, which is a charity partner for every initiative that a colleague signs up to. We also sponsor the Artemis, the Pentland Peaks, which is, if any of you are familiar with Edinburgh, with the hills around Edinburgh, a walk, gold, silver, bronze walk around the Pentland Peaks. But something else that we decided was to arrange some practice walks for people. It's kind of creating that link between physical and mental well-being, and also one of the charities that we supported at last year's Pentland Peaks was SANE. So our people are very involved. About 80% of our people took part in charitable initiatives last year. So for us, it's a bit about trying to bring our people together, whether it's through the Charitable Foundation and the work we do there, or whether it's just through lunches or activities like the types of activities that we're running this week, or various kind of lunch and learns, that kind of stuff. But for us, it is about trying to encourage people to come together, build connections, and really leaning on the Charitable Foundation, which is something we're really proud of.
And Debbie, you talked about creating psychological safety for employees. Can you tell us a bit more about how you try and imbue that into the culture?
Yeah, psychological safety is quite a posh word for trust, really, to be honest. But it's important not just from a mental health perspective, but from a business perspective. If you're working in an organisation where you can't feel you can raise things with a peer, with a line manager about something that's gone wrong, whether that be in your personal life or a work thing, if you feel you can't raise oh, I've done this, how can we solve it, for fear of the repercussions, then your organisation's going to really struggle from a culture perspective. So you've got to have the ability to create a culture where people feel that they can bring topics up, whether that be mental health, whether that be trouble with their finances, whether it be something that's gone wrong at work. Now, 9 times out of 10, how that's created is with the individual line manager. That's one of the key parts, because you can have all the best policies in the world, all the best strategies in the world. If when you turn to your manager and go, help, they go, shake your head or whatever, then whatever policy or culture you reckon you've got as an organisation might as well not exist, because that's not the individual experience someone has had. So it's really important that you try and build in what we expect everyone to understand as psychological safety as an organisation. So we've built it into our behavioural model called Values in Action. So we actually showcase that as that's the kind of behaviours that we expect from individuals, this psychological safety, this trust, this openness, vulnerability. And we've built that into our Values in Action document, so that if people are not behaving in that way that we would expect to create that culture, we actually have a way to be able to say to them, actually, this is the way we expect over here, and if you're not doing that, then there are consequences. So you can create that, because otherwise, going back to your point, how do you measure it? How do you manage what that outcome can be? So we built it into there. But the other way is communicating and storytelling. So the earlier panel mentioned how important storytelling is. It is, and at every level. So yes, senior leaders need to do that vulnerability, that storytelling, but equally, colleagues at every level need to do it, because some people associate more with someone like them. Because you might think, oh, it's all right that you've experienced that. You're, senior leader, you've got all this, you've got all that support, you can buy your way out of whatever. Sometimes the most powerful stories are from people like you, who've experienced that. And we spend an awful lot of time communicating. Communicate. That's what I tell my wellbeing team. We bang on about stories and culture and everything, because you cannot tell people enough times that it's okay not to be okay.
Sonia, one of the quotes in the report is about lubricating the pathways for mental health in order to build momentum. Can you explain that a bit to us and tell us some of the attributes?
It's probably linked to what I said before, that you can give all the provision in the world, but if people, it's the broccoli, leave it on the plate. If no one's coming to eat the broccoli, then it's a waste of money. So a real focus we had was not on provision, but how do you make it accessible, and how do you make sure people are aware of it? So accessibility, I think we've talked about. I mean, we have everything from an employee resource group, Minds, with their ambassadors. We have mental health first aiders. We have manager training. We have a huge list of things to make sure that as many people as possible in the organisation know about what is on offer. Last year, we launched a wellbeing hub, which specifically addresses life and career events and times of need. So if you're thinking of starting a family, if you're worried about money, if there's ill health in your family, there's a whole load of specific circumstances, and each one has an individual page that gives you some bite-sized learning, says this is what we would recommend for you to go to, come and speak to these people. So very clear, in your time of need, you don't want to be fishing through 20 different provision supplies to work out which one suits your circumstances. So being really targeted in that communication. And in terms of accessibility, so we have a health hub on site where we have on-site CBT, physio, GPs, health assessments, all of that kind of stuff. And what we found was people wouldn't come and book into CBT, but they did want to speak to someone. But they didn't want to speak to a colleague who was an ambassador or a mental health first aider. So we now have mental health drop-ins by our CBT professional, and it has so many more people, and he can cross-refer to himself in a clinical status. It effectively, by dropping in, can be triage, but someone's not had to formally book in for a mental health appointment, and they suddenly end up in treatment. Of course, they know, we don't hide it from them, but allowing someone to feel they're just having a private conversation that turns into them having treatment. And our concierge model means that they don't even need to call their health insurance to get approval because it's all pre-approved and we take care of the admin. You know, that streamlining of the pathways, making sure there's no barriers and no point that someone, to be honest, chickens out to actually access the support that would be helpful, has been another real focus and what I tried to mean by saying lubricating pathways.
Can I stick with you just for a minute on surveys? Because you talked about the indices that you've got, or the factors in your index. And we've got initiatives like this that you're talking about. So with the surveys, what sorts of things are you trying to capture? How are you actually using the data that you capture, and what sort of questions are you asking?
So we have all sorts of different data that we look at. So of the 3 pillars of our employee wellbeing model that I talked about, each one of those has about 5 different facets underneath it, and each one of those has between kind of 3 and 5 data points that we look at. Some are employee opinion surveys. Some are data around absence, unused holiday, etc. Some is our manager 180 feedback survey data. Some is on who's been logged on for way too long, excessively over a certain period of time, who's not using their holiday days. There's so many different data points that we look at. But if we're specifically looking at the employee engagement data, we ask 2 questions that are explicitly about well-being. So one is, do you believe that management is interested in your well-being? And the other is, are you able to balance your personal and work life? And we do track those over time. But when I'm doing my well-being analysis, I'm not just looking at those 2 questions. Those 2, for me, are kind of output measures. But actually, if someone's not able to balance their work life appropriately, why is that? Is it because they've also answered, actually, I don't have the tools and systems I need to allow me to do my job effectively? Is it because they've said, I don't have trust in my team and I don't feel that I can have an open conversation with my manager, and you can see that their manager 180 feedback has been pretty poor on some of those things? Is it because there's something around the culture, you don't believe in you don't have purpose, you don't believe in the services that we're providing? And so actually, of the 15 questions we ask kind of 3 times a year, I would say about 8 or 9 of them go in to my wellbeing analysis, which just captures how multifaceted mental health is and how many different things are important and can impact positively or otherwise how someone is.
Yeah, we have a similar basis with our employee sentiment survey as well. Kind of, we have can you balance your work and home life appropriately? How effective is your leader at supporting your health and well-being? We also have, how does Aviva support your well-being, to try and see if there's a difference. But then also, my workload is generally sustainable, which is a key one for us in terms of, you know, understanding the impact that might have. And then we do the same, we cross-reference that against broader engagement score, recommendation, you know, all those other questions that we ask in the survey. What happens? How do the 2 correlate in terms of question set? And that really does drive some insight that you can then use to understand what is it that's making people feel like that. Because only when you understand that can you start to think about what impacts you might be able to make to help address it.
Yeah.
And just, we use ours almost as a diagnostic, because it's a helpful vague flag to understand that part of the business, things seem to be getting worse and it seems to be to do with relationships, or it seems to be to do with this. Right, let's deploy a team to go in there. And that's when we saw our, you know, senior equities guys, indicators weren't looking great in terms of well-being. Okay, well, let's go and have an initial conversation. Okay, training's not going to help here. They've done training, they're not going to listen. What language do they speak? They speak data. Okay, rather than telling them that taking breaks is important for you, let's get someone in to measure their heart rates, measure their vitals, track them over a couple of periods, do an experiment with them to make it real. And it made it real, and suddenly the impact it has from them having gone through this experiment that was really meaningful and personal to them allowed it to be amplified through equities, and as Alison mentioned earlier, you then track the impact of that over a midterm. Although it was quite funny when you realise that everyone's vitals spiked after a certain meeting with a certain person, and you go, ooh, going to have to deal with that one. But it's, we got rid of some team meetings on certain days that were clearly draining everyone and making it really tailored and targeted based on the generic data that you get in that first stage. It just allows you to work out where to prioritize to get the most return from what you do next.
Can I ask a quick question? So as a firm then that's on the early stage of our journey on data, so we've started running employee engagement surveys. And it's really interesting that you can kind of triangulate the data you have. So for us, we can look at sort of stuff based on teams and what have you. We can't obviously get into the individual responses. So do you have an ability to track different data sets, or is it a team by team?
So for us, our data, we drill down, providing there's at least 5 respondents, so because you don't want to get into individual situations, but obviously across teams, so we can have team leader effectiveness scores and things like that. So yeah, we can dial across that, but never down to the individual. So, and verbatim comments are always actually, if you've got 10 verbatims or more, so they're actually more increased. Don't know about you.
So as a firm on the other end of the scale, so we've started our employee engagement surveys. We have very limited data, demographic data that we collect. So this year, we're going to start collecting more demographic data on a voluntary basis. But to dip our toes in the water, we used our employee engagement survey and we added some demographic data onto the end. One of the questions was about mental well-being, and 80% of staff responded, but then 20% responded prefer not to say. So it's quite interesting. So it's possibly around trust in the survey, or possibly that people are unsure why we're gathering the data, but that was kind of our precursor to our more formal data gathering that we're planning this year.
Yep.
As an aside, our prefer not to say category, which luckily is only about 2%, by far the most disengaged population we have across the board in
Agree.
all of our engagement stats. So it has to be to do with trust and belief, and it does. The only extra thing I would say on data is through our partnership with Nuffield, where we have some kind of, our CBT therapist is a Nuffield employee, but is seconded over to us, let's say part-time, they can access health data that we as an employer cannot, because all the health assessments are done that way, etc. And so we now have agreed parameters through which they will use the aggregated medical data to proactively approach groups based on health assessments, based on treatment plans, etc. That is, we know it's happening, but we have no idea who is being reached out to in those things. But for us, like taking it to the next stage was we have to be proactive and we have to be preventative. And data informs that, and you've got to find the way to make it within governance that you can get to the people who need it, even if they don't want to come forward themselves.
Thanks very much. So this report is a kind of proxy to best practice. So we asked everybody, what do you actually do, rather than being in an ivory tower and trying to pontificate about best practice. So in that spirit, are there any final words for the audience before we open to questions that you'd each hand over to? Obviously, companies are at different stages, but what sort of pearls of wisdom would you share in any order?
I'm going to jump straight in then. I would say start. That would be the first thing I would say, because a lot of people don't, because they think it's too big to tackle. So my first piece of advice is, wherever you are, just keep moving further, because that's the way to do it. I know that sounds really cliche, but people are put off because they think it's too big a piece of pie. Just take the first bite.
And I would build on that by saying listen. So listen to your people. What works for them? What do they value? Are they willing to get involved and engaged? And if they are, tap into that. We're a small firm. We can make things happen quite quickly. That's one of the beauties of being a firm of our size. So having people that are interested, engaged, and have ideas is just a great place to be.
My only other thought is, quite often I'll go home and go, oh, that was a tough day or something. It's like, at least, I'm not a doctor, at least I'm not saving lives. Actually, I could say that before I was in wellbeing. Now there are literally multiple times a year where things that we've put in place is saving lives. And so if you need a better reason to focus on it, although you're all here, so you're probably all focused on it already. So it's a wrong audience, but there's something about, of all the list of to-dos, this one is one of the most meaningful ones that it can possibly be, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a great finish. So, do we have any questions from the audience?
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for acknowledging that the fact that policies put in place at a company don't always filter through to teams. That's quite refreshing to hear because, it's, a company's only as good as your line manager makes it, really. So, yeah, just wanted to thank you for that.
Hiya, thank you very much. I want to join a couple of things that you all said. So with regards to what we acknowledged earlier about taking an intersectional approach to mental health, one thing I found is that resilience for people with protected characteristics is not particularly effective for them, simply because resilience is a natural antidote to resistance, and those with protected characteristics tend to meet more resistance than their counterparts. And Liz, yourself, you said about listening to your people. And my question is, given we talked about psychological safety, we know that there are people in an organisation who are naturally more resilient, which can make them more susceptible to burning out. How often do you employ external people to do cultural inquiries to check the cultural temperature of your organisation? Because Debbie, you said yourself, if people are afraid to speak out due to repercussions, in effect, that's oppression. And you can't genuinely get a real gauge of what your organisation is facing. So I was curious, how often do you employ external organisations to do a temperature check with those anonymous cultural inquiries?
We did a culture audit 3 years ago, which is why we then introduced our engagement surveys, because one of the findings was that we didn't have a formal mechanism for two-way feedback. So, I mean, that for us was kind of a one-off, I think. I don't know if we would do it again, but it was we had some really interesting findings, and it was probably for us something that helped us to make that start on the journey a bit more formally.
So my honest answer is I'm not 100% certain from a purely cultural perspective. I'd have to speak to our cultural lead to see whether they do anything direct. We do take culture temperature checks through things like the Stonewall submission, through Disability Action Forum, who come in and assess probably with that lens, but reaches into the mental health and the overall psychological safety. I know we do a lot of that. I don't know whether we have some specific culture company that comes in and does a reality check on that. I'm going to go and find out now.
We have done. So we have 14 employee resource groups who, for us, act in part as that kind of independent group representing those with different characteristics. And each time that we've said, okay, we need to expand our approach to more explicitly address this year neurodiversity, last year disability, the year before socioeconomic background, we have brought in an external party to do an independent valuation to inform then what responses we do. And they typically work quite closely with whoever has volunteered to be the ERG lead to establish that, so that as an organisation centrally, we aren't, HR, it's not a HR conversation, it's an independent conversation with people that hopefully those in that minority group can relate to. We're just about to kick off neurodiversity in that range. What we haven't done is then reappoint someone to do an equivalent study a few years later, because actually by then there's such an established relationship and group within the ERGs that actually they do the focus groups, they run that, and then they present the findings to us. But it's an interesting question.
Yeah, that's the same. Sounds very similar to our model.
One more question at the back.
Hi, everyone. Firstly, thank you very much for some really interesting insights. I just wanted to pick up on a point just made there, actually, about the challenge of setting a vision or a strategy and it not necessarily being picked up all the way throughout the business, particularly given it sounds that it's quite hard to collect data on an individual basis. So actually quite hard to identify the times where there might be someone who's not maybe adopting in the strategy in the way you want.
So one of the things actually we find is the employee resource groups are helpful with that. So particularly, so one of ours is Aviva Abilities that look after visible and hidden disabilities as well as neurodiversity, long-term medical conditions. So if you look at it purely from a mental health lens, quite often because they're apart from people function, HR, if someone's got a challenge and it's an ongoing challenge with their leader or whatever, quite often it'll be raised with the employee resource group, the communities in Aviva, and they will bring it to us either as a diversity, equity, inclusion team or as a wellbeing team for us to look at and address. So that's how we can sometimes find an individual that needs to be highlighted. But often peers, we have a really good Speak Up service. Whistleblowing service, we call it Speak Up. Some go through there, and we also have a resolution service within Aviva. So I get data off the back of the resolution service to see what of those are trending that might be mental health related in this case, also inclusion related in general, but yeah.
Great.
It's the hardest thing because everyone's going through something different. And if it's systemic in a team, if it's you can use the data. If it's not even to do with the work environment and you're trying, it raises a way bigger question actually of where the role of the employer is in this whole debate actually and where the line should be drawn. But it's the hardest thing. And people do slip through. Okay.
We are out of time. We've had the thing flashing at us saying we're out of time at the back there for a while. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. Could you give the panel a round of applause? And as I said, there's a lot of this stuff, some of the entries from the members here and from CCLA and CMHA in the report. So you'll get that straight after this session. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. I actually have the pleasure, or the easy job, of literally just closing and wrapping up. Thank you very much, Adriana. I just want to say a huge thank you to actually all the panellists. Some brilliant stories in terms of how you've practically done this, which helps us all as employers, but also the frameworks that you've mentioned and the strategies that you put in place. And it sort of reminds me whenever I come to one of these, just like how important it is to actually just discuss this and learn from it from different organisations. We actually recently in Aviva Investors hosted a town hall. It was our most dialed into session of any session, including our results session and bonus comms and everything that we run across the year. And it was earlier it was back end of last year, and it was just a bit of a wake-up call for me actually, just to think how important and sort of how critical it is to discuss it and do the storytelling, but actually help people really understand how to access this and keep that momentum. I took away a few things from the sessions. I just thought I'd play back some of my thoughts. I'm sure you've all taken your own as well, but. The first one is that there is some really clear and strong frameworks that are available, and you know the industry bodies that were here today, and there are others. I think are a great resource for us all to utilise. Certainly, we're all fighting to move up the benchmarks. Actually, the first thing I said to Debbie when she came in is we need to be higher next time. So, if you can change that for 2023, it'd be most appreciated. The wellbeing strategies are really fundamental and are key to sustainable business performance. As a sustainable investor, we obviously look through that lens as well. But what I really look at it is, from a talent perspective in our business, and how are we able to drive sustainable performance in our organisation. I love the sort of the human element coming out today. I sort of sit there and think like data is critical, and we always go there, and we always want more data. But that human element, making it real for somebody at an individual level or across a group of people, is really important. And really the work home, obviously it's come clear through the pandemic, but how much of that sort of the flexibility, the work-life balance, and how connected the two are is a key area for us all to think about. And then I love the wrap up. Start, you get on with it, listen, and remember you're making meaningful impact for people, and there's not much more sort of rewarding in all our jobs that you can do than that. So a big thank you from me and for the rest of the team. I know the Diversity Project and Adriana and the team have spent a lot of time on this as well, which brings me nicely to the famous QR code, which is here. So if you click that on your camera, you'll be able to access the report. There will also be lots of links here in terms of some of the resources that you can all access. Obviously, after today, feel free to reach out any of the panellists or the Diversity Project, and they can also help you. And so my final thing is just say a huge thank you for all coming, and again, a big thank you to all the panellists. And there is now some drinks next door if anybody who can stay for networking. So, thank you.